God's existence. Can we prove it? Is there any evidence that he exists? Well, there is an interesting way to approach this question, and it's through something called contingency. You see, when we look around at the world, we notice that things change. Maybe we're out in nature and we notice that the leaves, it's autumn right now. So currently the leaves are changing from kind of a green colour to a reddish orange colour. And this is natural. As winter begins to come in, the leaves might change, they might fall off, they might wither, and they might die. Or maybe we have a cup of water. It's room temperature, it's lukewarm. We put it into the fridge and the temperature of the water changes to cold water. Now this is something very basic, it's very fundamental. You might think, what is this guy smoking? Of course, we know things change. But how we answer this question, how we understand change, is actually really important, because it gets to the fundamental reality of how we view existence itself. And the ancient philosophers of Greece pondered this question quite a lot. And there was a man by the name of Parmenides who made the very bold assertion that change is not possible. He didn't believe it could happen. And he justified this in a very interesting way. He said, in order for something to change, well, I guess he could say he considered two things. He considered the existence of being and non-being. And in order for being to change, it must come from something. What is other than being is non-being, is nothing. But how can change come from nothing? It can't. Therefore, change is impossible. And that was Parmenides' assertion. But this seems counterintuitive. How can change be impossible? We see it with our senses, but maybe our intellect reveals that our senses are mistaken. Maybe there is this tension, this conflict between our intellect and our senses. But it's an interesting thing to consider. And, you can kind of rub your beard and say, okay, I can kind of understand where he's coming from with this. But while Parmenides was making this argument to the ancient Greeks in the Agora, as they were all sitting around wearing their white robes, Chad Aristotle walks in and he says, no, Parmenides, you're wrong, and cringe. And you forgot about one very important thing. And that thing is a thing's potentiality. You see, Aristotle pointed out that, let's say you take a book, for example. This book, this entity, is rectangular. This particular book is white and orange. It's quite solid. If I hit you over the head with that book, it's gonna hurt. You're not gonna be very happy with me. But these are all aspects of the book's nature. They're all inherent to its being. But if I took some heat to that book, I burned it, that book could potentially be a pile of ashes. If I painted the book blue, it could also be blue. So these things can change when it is actualized by something external to it. You see, Parmenides denied that was possible, because he only considered being and non-being. But Aristotle points out that there is also a thing's potentiality which can be actualized by some external source, like heat. Like heat might actualize the potential for this book to become ashes. And so potentiality and that whole idea of actuality and potency, act and potency and potentiality, is how we understand the change that occurs in this world, and is how we avoid that insidious attempt by philosophers like Parmenides to pit the intellect against the senses, which is a very dangerous thing. It's a very leads to some very problematic conclusions. So let's take this idea of act and potency and apply it to existence itself. Let's take a dog, for example. So a dog is made up, well, let me ask you this. How is the dog sustained in existence at this very moment? Like, what is the thing that is sustaining the dog's existence right now? It is the molecules that make up the dog. That's what's sustaining the dog in existence. But what is sustaining the molecules in existence? It's the atoms. The atoms sustain the molecules. And what sustains the atoms, the protons, and so on. So there's this chain of dependent entities. If the proton cease to exist, then the atoms cease to exist, and the molecules, and the dog. So they are all inherently and continuously dependent on one another at every single moment in time for their existence. Now, this is a chain that needs to be bottomed out by something that does not rely on another for its existence, something that is non-contingent, something that has no potentiality, that is pure actuality, the actus purus, as the scholastics would call it, and that which forms the bedrock of reality as we know it. And we know that there must be a primary mover, because if there wasn't, there can't be any causal power. And this is the thing, this primary mover, this non-contingent thing, which is that first cause, that first mover, is what we call God. But why? Why do we call it God? And this is an interesting question, because a lot of people will say, okay, I can see it, I understand why you might have this thing that is non-contingent, that bottoms out, that sustains reality in existence. But why call it God? Why would we attribute divine characteristics to it? Well, we can ask something like, does this non-contingent thing have parts? And it cannot have parts, because if it had parts, it would be contingent on those parts. So it must be immaterial, it must be non-composite, it must be utterly simple, and it must be one. It must be a unitary being. And matter exists in time and space. If there is no time and space for matter to exist, then it does not exist. So a thing that is not contingent must be immaterial, because it cannot be dependent on time and space. And that which is non-contingent cannot come into being, because if something comes into being, it implies a cause. So obviously the conclusion is, since God is immaterial, since he is non-contingent, he is also eternal. And there's more to this. There are other attributes like omniscience, omnipotence, perfect goodness, and so on. But suffice to say that once we establish that something non-contingent does exist, we can quite clearly and quite logically deduce that it has various attributes, divine attributes, that we would attribute to what we call God. Now, God is also incomprehensible in some sense. We can discern certain attributes that he might have, like we can know certain attributes, but these attributes are of a negative sort. We know he is not composite. We know he is not material. We know he does not exist in time and space. So we have a loose understanding of something about God, but it's only in this loose sense. As we begin to strip away the limitations of physical reality as we know it, much of God's nature remains mysterious. And I often think of St. Thomas Aquinas. He was one of the greatest minds in Western philosophy, in the history of humanity, you could say. And he wrote, he thought, he reflected on the nature of God's existence, and he has some very profound insights. I mean, if you read his books, even just one page of his works can contain some of the most beautiful and profound insights into God as we know it. But even he, such was the magnanimity of his knowledge, even he, when he had an encounter with the divine, he had a mystical experience with God. And after that experience, he said, everything that I have written seems like straw in comparison to what I have seen. It's like nothing. It doesn't even come close. Although it may be profound, it might be insightful, it doesn't even come close to capturing the glory of the Creator. And he died not long after having that mystical experience, and is now receiving his eternal reward. But kind of rambling here. But one thing I want to say though, this argument from contingency, this is a very brief oversimplification of that argument, kind of off the top of my head. I'm not even sure if it was entirely coherent, but we'll see. But another thing I would like to establish is that this argument does not necessarily get us to religion. And that's true. It doesn't prove Christianity. It doesn't prove that God became incarnate. Although, I do believe that there is a logical fittingness. When we get to this non-contingent thing, and we kind of discern the various attributes that he has, we can basically logically conclude or deduce that this God would become incarnate as a means of reconciling with his creation. I can probably talk about that another time, but I think that's a very interesting angle to kind of get from this God, this kind of classical God of classical theism, to the actual God of Christianity, the incarnate God. But anyway, that's enough for now.